aux participants et invités de la conférence sur la décroissance dans les Amériques. Je vais inviter Monsieur le vice-recteur de la vie académique de l'UQAM à prendre la parole. Merci.
Monsieur le conférencier, Monsieur Suzuki, Mesdames les organisatrices et Messieurs les organisateurs de ce colloque, distingués invités, chers participantes et chers participants, et bien sûr, chers amis, bonjour et bienvenue à l'UQAM. Sachez que je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous ce matin pour accueillir notre conférencier d'honneur et docteur honoris causa de l'UQAM, M. David Suzuki, dans le cadre du colloque sur la décroissance dans les Amériques. L'UQAM est en quelque sorte le dernier arrêt de ce colloque interuniversitaire qui a débuté le 13 mai et qui se clôturera demain en nos murs à la salle Pierre-Mercure. 20 ans après le sommet de la Terre à Rio, associé croissance économique et développement durable apparaît toujours et plus que jamais problématique. Cette association ne semble pas en mesure d'offrir des solutions convaincantes aux grands problèmes sociaux, environnementaux et économiques qui sévissent actuellement. Tel que mentionné à plusieurs reprises au cours de ces derniers jours, un avenir durable implique de repenser, et c'est précisément le mot, repenser la relation entre la croissance économique et le bien-être, l'État et l'environnement. De nombreuses solutions ont été proposées cette semaine par les scientifiques, les militants, les artistes et les environnementalistes. Je souligne ici aussi la contribution des communautés autochtones au débat et à notre réflexion. Les pistes de solutions proposées portent toutes sur la décroissance, un concept clé qui repose sur un autre mode de vie et dont les valeurs dominantes sont la simplicité et le partage. Ces enjeux occupent d'ailleurs une place de plus en plus importante pour une bonne partie de la population mondiale. On n'a qu'à penser aux divers mouvements d'indignés un peu partout sur la planète pour s'en convaincre. Aujourd'hui et demain, vous poursuivrez vos réflexions sur le concept de décroissance afin notamment de réfléchir sur un modèle économique alternatif, d'inventer des manières inédites de vivre ensemble et de préserver les conditions d'existence à long terme de l'humanité. En encourageant et en mettant de l'avant des idées à la fois critiques et créatives, l'UQAM, en tant qu'établissement universitaire, joue sans contredit un rôle essentiel quant à la réflexion sur ces problématiques. Et c'est grâce, entre autres, à des événements comme celui-ci qu'ensemble, nous pourrons relever ces défis planétaires. C'est justement grâce à de telles rencontres où l'on favorise les discussions et le partage des idées que l'UQAM peut contribuer à l'avancement des connaissances dans ce champ d'expertise. En terminant, je profite de cette occasion pour saluer nos universités partenaires de ce colloque, l'Université de Montréal et l'École des hautes études commerciales, l'Université Concordia et l'Université McGill, qui partagent nos efforts pour développer des programmes de recherche et de formation axés sur l'excellence dans le domaine de la responsabilité sociale et du développement durable. Je remercie bien sûr également tous les partenaires du colloque, des partenaires précieux sans lesquels notre université ne pourrait tenir une telle rencontre aujourd'hui pour diffuser la recherche, les idées et les connaissances. Je vous souhaite donc à tous et à tous une excellente réflexion et une bonne journée. Merci.
Merci, M. Pro, pour votre allocution. Et même s'il aimerait rester avec nous, il a malheureusement d'autres engagements qui lui forcent à nous quitter. Donc, merci beaucoup. J'inviterai maintenant M. Peter Brown, qui est membre du comité programme de la conférence, qui est aussi co-auteur d'un livre qui s'appelle Rights Relationship, avec notre directeur coordonnateur de la conférence, Jeff Graver, que vous avez vu courir et organiser tout ça. Les livres, vous pouvez les voir, les feuilleter, l'acheter et les faire signer parce qu'ils se trouvent en avant. Donc, Peter Brown est professeur à l'Université McGill et, comme je l'ai dit, c'est membre du comité de programme de la conférence. Et c'est dit qu'il va être le président de séance durant la conférence de M. Suzuki. Peter?
I'm sure everybody appreciates the absurdity of me introducing David Suzuki, since everybody in the room knows who he is, but hardly anybody knows who I am. It's really an honor, and I just want to mention a couple of things. One is, one of the themes of the conference has been the need for a new worldview, a new way of understanding the human place in the universe. And David brings it really in at least two dimensions of his work. One, obviously, his distinguished work in science, but also his work with the First Nations. And these are wellsprings of insight and wisdom that we need to draw on as we fashion a new world for our species and for the rest of the commonwealth of life. It is not simply a matter of human survival, but the survival of the flourishing. The survival and flourishing of life on the earth that's at stake in our era. So, as it's been mentioned, Hans Jonas really was one of the philosophical theoreticians who called attention to the need for a complete rethink of our ethical standards, and that unfortunately is progressing only very slowly. But I think the work that David is doing builds a foundation for going forward with that. The other thing I just want to call to your attention is that I didn't know this till I was doing my preparations for this introduction. David spent his very early years in an internment camp run by the Canadian government because of his Japanese origins. This is obviously, looked back from his vantage point in history, an illegitimate and overreaching use of state power. Right? Now, in our era, in the last few years, we are confronting similar problems, right? The illegitimate use of state power and the undermining of our institutions of democracy. So David and I are about the same age, so I guess I can say this. So his life sort of began on this issue. And in his or my mature years, we're coming back to the same thing, right? To becoming a spokesman for or keeping up his tradition of being a spokesman in favor of democracy, in favor of an open and a society with a government worthy of respect. And so I think this is a gift to us, to this planet, and to our country, to have him with us today. Thank you very much.
Merci, Peter. Excusez-moi, mais j'habite à Vancouver, Colombie-Britannique, où nous ne parlons pas français. Alors, je ne suis pas bilingue et je parlerai en anglais. Excusez-moi. I hate coming to your country and speaking in a foreign language. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I haven't been able to attend this wonderful conference, and I congratulate you, Peter, on being one of the organizers of this very, very important conference on an important topic. I'm honored to be here, but I also am humbled by all of the expertise that I've already learned you've been exposed to, and I feel like a complete amateur. What I'm going to do is just offer you a critique as a pop scientist, but mainly I'm here to speak today as an elder. We're not the same age, Peter. I'm 76 years old. I'm in the last part of my life, and I'm telling other elders, get off your ass, don't go golfing, play the most important role of your life now. You've lived a lifetime from which to draw experience and knowledge and pass that on to future generations. This is the most important part of my life. And what I have found is as my testosterone levels have been dropping, I'm getting really smart. Because I'm not thinking about sex every minute, and now I see why my wife always knocks me down in arguments, because she's not encumbered by the problem of testosterone. So I speak to you today as an elder that no one can accuse of having an alternate agenda driven by the desire for power or celebrity or money. And what I find is, looking back over a lifetime, thinking about people I've known, human beings are really a remarkable species. We are the ones that have composed music, that make art, that write poetry, and that do science. We exhibit every promise of intelligence. Yet, we seem determined to obliterate the very life support systems of the planet. Ever since Mr. Harper gained a majority government, I've been thinking a lot about the environment and the environmental movement and where we are heading. And I'd like to say at this point it's very clear to me that the environmental movement has fundamentally failed and is failing at the present time. This is not in any way a denigration or a denial of the enormous progress that the movement has had since it began in 1962. When Rachel Carson, this is the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring. And when her book was published, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. The word environment didn't mean what we have come to understand it to be today. Just think of what's happened since then. Within 10 years, the United Nations has formed the United Nations Environment Program and called the first global conference on the environment in Stockholm. And now, we have departments or committees on the environment from every level, of the municipal through the provincial and federal and even international levels. We have laws in Canada deemed to protect clean air, clean water, endangered species, and millions of acres of land have been set aside as parks. That's been the great success of the environmental movement. But I believe that as we fought to protect these various aspects of our surroundings in Canada, we got so focused on each battle to stop clear-cut logging, pollution of this river, building this dam, drilling for oil in Hecate Strait. We felt that if we could succeed in that battle, that somehow we had passed a critical point. But we failed to realize that those were just symptoms of deep underlying forces that were causing us to be destructive over and over again. And here I believe that where we have failed. Over and over, I've been told by politicians and business people, listen, Suzuki, let's get down to the reality. You have to be realistic. The economy is the bottom line. We can't afford to do what you guys are demanding if we don't have a strong, growing economy. And Mr. Harper epitomizes our failure to recognize that the real bottom line is not dictated by the economy, but in fact is dictated by our biological nature. Our bottom line is the things that keep us alive and healthy: the air, the water, the soil, the sunlight captured in photosynthesis, and other species. And it reflects a different way of seeing our place when you have this switch to see through the lenses of environmentalism, that we see a different place for our home, where we belong. For most of human existence, we've always known that we're a part of nature and utterly dependent on it. For most of our existence as a species, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and we certainly followed the plants and animals through the seasons. We were very, very cognizant of our place in the natural world. It's 10,000 years ago when the agricultural revolution began, and we became farmers. It transformed the way that we live. But farmers understand that we are utterly dependent on the seasons, on climate, on weather, that we need insects to pollinate flowering plants, that we can find plant species that take nitrogen from the air and fix it as fertilizer in the soil. Farmers understand that we are a part of and dependent on the natural world. In 1900, there were well, I hate to say only, there were 1.5 billion people, but only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. The vast majority of people on the planet lived in rural village communities because we were an agrarian species. But in a mere 100 years, we underwent an incredible transformation. By the year 2000, our population had quadrupled to 6 billion, but there were now hundreds of cities of more than 1 million people, and in a country like Canada, over 80% of us now live in big cities. And we had expanded to 6 billion, and every person on the planet, now we're at 7, has to breathe air, drink water, eat food, clothe, and shelter ourselves. And that means just the act of living, because there are so many of us, means that we have a very heavy ecological footprint. It takes a lot of air, water, and land to support us, to keep us alive. There were never 1 billion mammals of one species on the planet. Chuck, is that right? This is what I calculate. There were never 1 billion mammals. We are the first mammal to achieve 1 billion population, and we have broken a crude but simple biological principle that the population, the maximum population of a species, is inversely proportional to its size. Now, what that means is the bigger you are, the more land and space is required. No, I don't believe that. Maybe hundreds of millions, but not billions. Billions is a lot. But but there is a principle that size is inversely related, as a rule, to numbers. But if you're an elephant or a whale, you may number in the tens of thousands. But if you're a mouse or a shrew or a rat, there can be tens of millions of you. But humans have broken that simple principle, of course, through technology and trade. And we have now achieved a level of numbers that are unprecedented for any mammalian species in the history of life on Earth. In only 100 years, virtually all of the technology that we take for granted as a part of our civilization was invented and developed. And that starts with cars and planes and radios and telephones and on all the way up to computers. And that technology has amplified our ability to take from the planet, amplified our ecological footprint far beyond any other species. In my simple-minded analysis, I look at the consumptive pattern of our species as something that was deliberately inculcated in our economy and the way we live. This is just a pop analysis, but we have developed an incredible appetite for stuff ever since the Second World War. And we have to remember that the world was plunged into that terrible time after the stock market crash in 1929. The Great Depression was a terrible time. My parents became adults during that period, and it left a strong scar on them. They were deeply shaped by those difficult times. And so when my sisters and I were born, we learned from our parents the lessons that they learned through the Depression. Live within your means. Save some for tomorrow. Share, don't be greedy. Help your neighbors. You never know when you may need their help. You have to work hard to earn money to buy the things you need, not the things you want, the things you need. But they taught us you don't run after money, as if having more money or stuff makes you a bigger, more important person than others. Indeed, we were taught to feel sorry for people that bragged about their new car or their fancy clothes, that they somehow had got down the wrong line. Those homilies that they taught us, I've passed on to my children, but they seem so unbelievably quaint and irrelevant to the way that we live today. World War II pulled us out of the Great Depression. Wars are great to get economies going. Man, you got to produce a lot of stuff for killing people. And as it was clear that the Allied forces were going to win World War II, you all know that A major conference of the Allied countries was held in Bretton Woods in 1944. John Maynard was the leading economist there, but politicians, economists were there to talk about what do you do at the end of the war with a planet that basically had been bitterly smashed, or country. How do we pull ourselves out of that? And out of Bretton Woods emerged GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We got the World Bank, the IMF, and tying world currency to the American greenback, and it worked. I mean, you think about the post-war years, two of the countries that had been pounded by the war, Germany and Japan, became two of the most powerful economies on the planet. But they left nature out of that economy. They left nature in all of their jiggering and poking. They forgot to include nature as a part of the equation. And all of the services that you've heard about in the past few days, I'm sure, the exchange of carbon for oxygen, the filtering of water, nitrogen cycles, pollination, and so on, all of those were forgotten or ignored in those deliberations. The American president established the Council of Economic Advisors to the president and asked them, how do we transform a wartime economy into a peacetime economy? And the answer was consumption. We have to make consumption an American way of life. Get Americans to worship at the altar of consumption. Buy stuff, use it up, throw it away, and buy more stuff. And it worked. And soon growth in the economy became seen because of the parallel between all of the material benefits of that growth, that economic growth, and the growth in the economy itself. They seem to become synonymous. So that growth has now become the very purpose of government, keep that economy growing. And 70% of that economy is dependent on stuff, on consumption. So I wasn't surprised after 9/11 when Mr. Bush's first speech to American people included the command, go out and shop. And it wasn't a joke, because without shopping and all that stuff, we're in deep economic trouble. And now, despite the warnings of John Maynard Keynes to keep the economy domestic, our leaders boast of the benefits of globalization, in which companies are now free to move to areas with the lowest wages, with the lowest environmental protection, the lowest level of health care, to maximize profits. And in a global economy, the ecological and social costs of the things that we buy are deeply hidden. The global economy exploits the entire planet as a source of raw materials, the entire planet to dump our wastes and toxic materials. But when we buy a product, all of that is hidden. I see people go into a store to buy a cotton shirt. Nobody asks, is this organic? Cotton is one of our most chemically intensive crops that we grow. When you look at the Soviet Union in the 1950s, deciding to make the area in the central part of the continent the largest cotton growing area in the world, and they did. And look at the disaster that happened around the Aral Sea, that was once the fourth largest inland body of water in the world and is now the 10th, because it's shrunk so drastically through the exploitation of water. And that Aral Sea is almost devoid of fish, but loaded with toxic chemicals. We don't see that. We just want to go in and buy a shirt with a logo on it, and we pay our money, and out we go. And yet the very act of purchasing that product has repercussions that go around the world. We buy a car, a computer, or a television set. We don't ask, gee, where did all the metals in this product come from? Mining is one of our most destructive activities. We don't ask, what are the ecological consequences of the mine? What about the social impact on the people that are dependent on those mines? Are they getting a healthy wage? We don't ask any of those questions. We just want a product that works well, and we can go and brag about it, and we buy it, and there we go. And yet the act of purchasing that product has repercussions that ripple around the world, but those are all hidden in our global economy. So when you add all of this together, our numbers, our technological muscle power, our consumptive demand, and our global economy, we have become a geological force on the planet. There was never a single species able to alter the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the planet as we are now doing. Not long ago, a few decades ago, we referred to tornadoes and hurricanes and drought and floods and forest fires and earthquakes as natural disasters or acts of God. But they aren't anymore. We've taken our place of the gods as a factor in causing these events. They're not natural anymore. And you all have heard that geologists who divide the epoch of geological history of this planet into various stages of Eocene, Miocene, Holocene, and so on, and suggest that this is the Anthropocene epoch, the period when human beings have become so powerful we are now a geological force. How on earth did we get to this point? I'm a biologist, and I think in evolutionary time. I'm a geneticist, and I'm very, very impressed with the way that scientists can now use DNA to track the movement of human beings across the planet. And all the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. I can't wait to get invited to speak by the Ku Klux Klan and tell all these pointy-headed characters that we're all Africans. That's where we were born. And try to imagine the time at which our species appeared. There were still woolly mammoths in the world. There were saber-toothed tigers, giant moa birds. The world was a very different place. And if you try to imagine the plains of Africa as we appeared, they must have been filled with animals in abundance and variety beyond anything that we know in the Serengeti today. So in this vast plain covered with animals, with wondrous animals, would appear these little clumps of 3, 4, or 5 furless, two-legged apes. And that was us. And seen in that context, you got to admit, we weren't very impressive. I'm sure no other species looked at us and went, "Oh my God, watch out for that naked ape man! They're going to take over the planet." I mean, what the hell did we have going for us? There weren't many of us. We weren't big. We weren't fast. We weren't strong, and we weren't endowed with sensory abilities. Our great gift was invisible. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. It was the human brain that was our key to our enormous success, that overcame our lack of physical and sensory ability. With the human brain, we were endowed with a massive memory. We were innately curious, and we were very, very creative. And those qualities were an enormous advantage to us. We could dream of worlds of things that didn't exist. We could imagine. We could organize what we could see around into something that made sense to us, into a worldview in which everything was connected to everything else. And we imagined how we came to be and invented a concept called the future. No other animal on the planet has a sense of future as we do. And because we invented the concept of a future, we are the only animals that realize we can affect that future by what we do today. Based on our knowledge and experience, we could actually look ahead and imagine if we did this or went that way, the dangers we might encounter, whereas the opportunities might lie in a different action or direction. And we could deliberately choose today to avoid the dangers and exploit the opportunities. I believe foresight was the great strategy of survival that gave us the huge leg up. Foresight brought us to every continent on the planet and to this point of enormous domination of the earth. And now for over 40 years, scientists, armed with supercomputers, have been acting in the best tradition of our species, drawing on their knowledge to look ahead, see where the dangers and opportunities lie, and then warn us how we have to move in order to avoid the dangers and exploit the opportunities. And these warnings have been coming with increasing urgency and desperation. I want to just give you one remarkable document that was released in November of 1992. This is called World Scientist Warning to Humanity. And it was signed by over 1,700 scientists. When you look at the list of scientists. These are not third-rate scientists. These are the top scientists in the world. Over half of all living Nobel Prize winners at the time of this publication were signatories to this document. So this is pretty serious stuff. What were they warning us about? Let me read a few lines from this document. Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to support life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. And then they go on and list the areas where the collision is occurring with the atmosphere, water, resources, oceans, soil, forests, species, and population. And then the words grow even more bleak. No more than one or a few decades remain, and this was in 1992, before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost, and the prospects for humanity immeasurably diminished. We, the undersigned senior members of the world scientific community, hereby warn all humanity of what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. And then they go on and list the 5 things that they believe we must begin to do immediately. This is a frightening document, if for no other reason that scientists of this stature are not used to signing such a strong call to action. They're very conservative, very reluctant to have that kind of public eye. But if this is a frightening document, the response of the media around the world is terrifying. There was no response. Our national broadcaster, the CBC, our national newspaper at that time, the Globe and Mail, didn't bother to cover it. And none of the major American television networks bothered to report it. And you think about that, over half of all living Nobel Prize winners said we could have as little as 10 years to avoid absolute catastrophe. And this was considered not newsworthy. And I can tell you, if Brad Pitt ever farted in public, that would be banner headlines in every newspaper around the world. What the heck is going on here? The failure of environmentalism has been a failure to point out that we live in a world that is shaped by the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. We live in a world where we don't deny that the speed of light is a limitation on how fast our space vehicles can travel. Now, I know the people at CERN think they've got something that travels 6 kilometers faster than this. Well, if you're a betting person, I'll take your bet on that one. Still, at the present time, it's the speed of light that's the limit. We know there are laws of gravity, that the law of entropy tells us that we can't build a perpetual motion machine. We know that. Those are laws of physics that shape the world we live in. In chemistry, we know that diffusion constants, reaction rates, the property of elements dictate the kinds of chemical reactions that can be carried out, the speed and the kinds of molecules that can be synthesized. We know that. That's dictated by the properties of atomic substances. And in biology, we know that there are concepts of carrying capacity. We know that as animals, we have an absolute need for clean air, clean water, clean soil, sunlight by photosynthesis, and other species on the planet. Animals like us have an absolute dependence for our health and well-being on those things. We know that. Biology dictates that. Other things, though, we have become very so impressed with ourselves, and especially the enormous progress that we've had in this century, that we come to think that we dictate everything, we shape the world around us, and that those are the most important things that we have to pay attention to. So we love to draw lines around our property, around our cities, around our provinces and countries. And boy, we take those boundaries very serious. We'll go to war. We'll kill and die to protect those boundaries. But you know what? Nature couldn't give two shits about human boundaries. I mean, can you imagine spawning salmon coming from Alaska and then saying, oh shit, I can't spawn here at the Canadian River? Like, what's going on? Do we think that insects or birds or even plants pay attention to human boundaries? And you think of, I just learned the other day this wonderful film I saw called Earth from Space. And one of the statements was that every day 54,000 tons of dust fall in the United States, washed over from Africa. I mean, these are the idea that human boundaries somehow are going to be so critical in shaping the world is ludicrous. And then we invent other notions, like capitalism, like the economy, corporations, markets. And boy, again, do we ever take these seriously? I mean, a few hundred years ago, people believed in dragons and demons and monsters. I mean, we really believed them. If we thought they were pissed off at us, we'd give them jewels, we'd give them gold, we'd sacrifice virgins, anything to get them off our back. Well, we now know those are figments of our imagination. Nobody believes in dragons or demons or monsters. But what do? We simply substitute it with another human-created thing. I mean, I was talking to Preston Manning a few months ago. For the non-Canadian visitors, he's one of the leading members of the right wing in Canada. And, we were chatting away, and then I said something about, the market. And he went, it was amazing. He went, the market. It was like, the market, hallelujah, free the market, let the market do it. Literally. I mean, these people think this is like a dragon and demon. A few years ago, and boy, do we get worried if we think the market's in trouble. I mean, we'll send, not many virgins left, but gold, whatever. We'll give it to the market, really. I mean, just look at the way we write about the economy in the newspaper. Oh, the economy's not doing too well today, and we get scared stiff. And yet, so what happens then as a result of our taking ourselves so important? Copenhagen 2 years ago, 192 countries trying to deal with the atmosphere that doesn't belong to anyone through the lenses of 192 national boundaries and 192 economic priorities. And we think that we're going to shoehorn nature into our boundaries and our creations. We can't change the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, but we can sure as hell change the ideas or the concepts of capitalism, economics, markets, and so on. We did it once in 1944. As I say, we did it in 1944 at Bretton Woods, and we're long overdue for a Bretton Woods 2 to get nature back in as part of that economic system. Why can't we see that the only things that we can change or manage, attempt to manage, are humans and human creations? There is no way we can manage nature. We have this illusion that we can manage nature. Now that we've screwed up the atmosphere by overloading it with carbon, we're going to try even bigger management with geoengineering. Well, listen, the only thing we can manage is ourselves, and that's a tough enough challenge when you look at how we manage our international relationships. But the only thing we can change are the concepts that we create. Why can't we see this? Why is Mr. Harper so blind to this bottom line? And I believe a huge part of it is the fact that we've undergone an enormous transformation in the last 100 years, not just in population and technology and so on, but we went through a transformation in the way that we live. In 1900, as I say, when there were 1.5 billion people, there were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. The vast majority of people around the world lived in rural village communities because we were a farming animal, and farmers know very well we depend on nature. In only 100 years, we've been utterly transformed. Now, over 80% of us in Canada live in big cities. And in a city, it's easy to think, well, we're different from other creatures. We're smart. We're so smart, we create our own habitat. And as long as we have a few parks and reserves out there where we can go camping and playing, who needs nature? I have a friend that lives in Toronto. This is an amazing story, but it's true. He lives in the north end of Toronto in a high-rise apartment, completely air-conditioned. In the morning, he goes down the elevator into the basement, gets into his air-conditioned car, and drives down the Don Valley Freeway into the basement of the building he works in, all air-conditioned. That building is connected through a whole series of tunnels to huge shopping areas and food markets. And he said to me, David, I don't have to go outside for weeks. That's the kind of world we live in a city. Who needs nature? In a city, your highest priority is your job. You need a job to earn the money to buy the things that you want. Now, it's not what you need, but what you want. And so the economy then becomes transformed into our highest priority. And what is the result of that then? It's that Mr. Harper, for over 10 years now, has said, we can't do anything about climate change. If we try to do something about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it'll destroy the economy. So he has elevated the economy above the very atmosphere that gives us our seasons, that gives us our weather and our climate. So we forget, in elevating economics above the environment, that the very word economics comes from the Greek word ethos, meaning household or domain. I prefer to call it Mother Earth. That the economy is established to manage our home, planet Earth. Ecologists come from the same word, study our home, and ecologists try to define what are the conditions, the principles, the laws that determine whether a species, any species, can survive and flourish. Not a bad bit of information. I would have thought any organization, any government, any corporation, before embarking on a new program, would say, wait a minute now, before we do anything, what are those ecologists telling us? Mr. Ecologist, what are those principles or those conditions? But no, we elevate ourselves up and we say, no, the corporate agenda is the most important. And then you ecologists, you can deal with what you do after the fact. We've got it all reversed. So what is the failure of the environmental movement? I believe that it's the transformation from what we call an anthropocentric worldview, where everything revolves around us, to a biocentric worldview, where we are a part of a complex community of organisms. And you hear about the anthropocentric worldview all the time. You hear about it when we hear reference to the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line refers to society, the economy, and the environment. And often they're depicted as three circles of equal size. And when these circles intersect, then you find, guess what? There's a region in the middle where all three of the circles overlap. And that's the sweet spot. You focus on that part where all three overlap, and whatever you do benefits the triple bottom line. And that's the kind of mentality that we now operate under. This is the most absurd, this is the most dangerous idea I can imagine. Are we saying the economy is the same size as society, which is the same size as the environment? I mean, to me, the biocentric worldview is much closer to reality, which sees one big circle, and that's the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. And within the biosphere are 10 to 30 million smaller circles of varying size and overlapping in different ways. And that's the 10 to 30 million species of plants and animals that inhabit the planet. But the reality is one of those species has ballooned out and occupies 40% of that space within the biosphere. And that's us. We are now co-opting, according to Ehrlich, we're co-opting over 40% of the net primary productivity of the planet. That is all of the sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis that drive living organisms around the planet. We are now co-opting 40% of that. So we've become bloated beyond anything ever in the history of life on Earth. We're occupying a huge chunk of that, and we, of course, drive other species to extinction by the demand that we increase that co-option of net primary productivity. And within that circle that represents us, that's already way too big, there should be one much smaller circle, which is the economy. And I believe that if we don't make the transition from the anthropocentric to the biocentric point of view, then we're going to continue to have battle after battle after battle. And the forces that are driving the anthropocentric view are very, very powerful. So how we know, you know, the consequences of this anthropocentric worldview, which is a very brief one in our history. And I don't have to document the trouble that we're in. The oceans are in just horrible shape. We've lost over 80% of our forests. We've spread our toxic compounds throughout the air, water, and soil, driving over 50,000 species to extinction a year, and on and on and on it goes. How we have a crisis that's extremely urgent. How do we bring about change? Well, there are many of my colleagues who believe that it's now too late, that we've passed too many tipping points to go back. So Sir Martin Rees, one of Britain's most eminent scientists and the Royal Astronomer, was asked recently on BBC, what do you think the chances are that our species will survive to the end of this century? And his answer shocked me. He said, 50-50. Now, if that isn't a warning call, I don't know what is. As you know, Jim Lovelock, who invented the idea of Gaia as the web of all living things on Earth, believes that it's too late, that over 90% of us will be gone by the end of the century. And Clyde Hamilton, an eminent eco-philosopher in Australia who wrote the book Affluenza, has now written a book called Requiem for a Species. And guess what species it's a requiem for? I've read it, Clyde's book, from cover to cover. There's nothing in there I disagree with. I thank these scientists for laying it on the line that we are in an urgent crisis. But I say, if you want to say it's too late, please shut up and go away. I just don't see the point of saying it's too late, because if you say it's too late, that totally deflates you. We're going to fight to the end regardless of whether it's too late. But saying it... So, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I mean, the optimists believe good things are going to happen. Pessimists believe bad things. But I'm also enough of a rationalist to see where all the curves are heading. We're in deep trouble, and it's very urgent. But the one thing I cling to and pass on to you is hope. What has to drive us is hope. Hope that there can be change. Hope that we can make transitions. And I base this not on some kind of Pollyanna-ish idea, but on the reality that we don't know enough to say it's too late. It would be too arrogant to say that we've tried everything and it's just too late. And I use a real-life example to point this out. Of the species of salmon, the 5 species of salmon in North America, the most valued species is the sockeye. They're the ones that have the bright red flesh that we love to buy. The biggest run of sockeye salmon in the world is in British Columbia, in the Fraser River. 3 years ago, we got just over 1 million sockeye coming back up the Fraser. Now, before contact with Europeans, the Fraser sockeye run was over 100 million fish. After humans came in and blasted and dammed part of the Fraser River by accident, it fell down to a level where 35 million was considered a big run. We got just over 1 million 3 years ago, and I said to my wife, that's it. I mean, you can't sustain a population like that with just 1 million animals coming back to spawn. A year later, we got the biggest run of sockeye in 100 years. Now, I use this to point out not how stupid I am, because nobody knows what the hell happened. But nature surprised us. We don't know enough to predict what's going to happen, and my hope is based on the fact that if we can give nature a chance, pull back on our impact, we can hope that nature will be far more forgiving than we deserve. And that's what impels me. I'd just like to end my talk with 2 stories. And that is, the first one is about the most important teacher in my life was my father. And my father was my mentor and great role model and hero. He was In 1994, he was 85 years old. He was dying of cancer, and he knew it. He wasn't in pain, and he was not afraid of death, which all impressed the hell out of me. I moved in to live with him and care for him the last 2 months of his life. And that was one of the happiest times that I spent with my father. We laughed, we talked, we cried, or we just sat together and read without saying a word. And every night my wife would come over with the kids and show slides of trips that we'd taken with Dad. And he'd look forward to that and say, what wonderful trip are we going on tonight? And he kept saying over and over that last couple of months, David, I die a rich man. He was never a wealthy man. But as we talked, I realized he never once said, David, do you remember that great car I had in 1985? Do you remember that house we bought in London, Ontario? Do you remember that closet full of fancy clothes? Never. That's just stuff. All we talked about were family, friends, and neighbors, and the things we did together. And to him, that was his wealth. And indeed, he was a rich man in those experiences. And he showed me. We've got off on some weird tangent where we think money and stuff is what life's all about and gives us happiness. And I'm telling you, on his deathbed, he showed me that what matters is our relationships and the experiences with other human beings. The other story I'd like to tell is I live in a wonderful part of the world, in Vancouver, the most beautiful city in North America. Please come and visit us, but don't stay. Go back. We don't want you all. This is especially to Canadians. Go away, come visit, but don't stay. Anyway, I live right on the water in Vancouver, and we've lived there now for 35 years. In the 1990s, as Hong Kong was getting ready to revert to China, many Hong Kong Chinese began sending their money out to Canada to buy property. And I got a letter in the mail from a real estate agent that said, now is a great time to sell your house and buy up. I'd never heard the phrase buy up. I didn't know what that meant, but apparently you buy a little house and then you get a starter house and then you get a big, and which is just a disgusting concept to me, because my house is my home. I've lived there for 35 years. And I thought, okay, if I was to put this place on the market, what would I list as the things that make it my home, that make it so important to me? And the first thing I put down was the fact that when we bought the home, I asked my wife's mother and father to come and live with us when they retired in a suite that I built above our own apartment. And for 35 years, my children have had grandma and granddad upstairs living in the same house. And I wrote that down as something of very great importance and value to me. My father was a cabinet maker. When Tara and I were first married, he built a set of kitchen cabinets for our apartment. And when I bought this house, I ripped it off the wall and put it into our kitchen. It doesn't fit at all. Looks like hell. But every time I open that cabinet door, I think of my father, and I put that down. I've got under the dogwood tree, my kids have brought back roadkill, snakes and birds and rats, and they have a little animal garden underneath the dogwood tree, and I wrote that down. And my father-in-law is an avid gardener, and he knows I love raspberries and asparagus. And I came back from a month trip to the States one year, and the first person I met at the house was my father-in-law with a bag, and he said, this is the first cut of asparagus that came off this year, and I saved it for you. And I wrote that down. And I realized as I made that list, those are the things that make my house far more than a piece of real estate or property. It's my home. And those are the things that for me are priceless. But on the market, they are worthless. And that's the problem.